people are listening to you, and they're very influenced by what you're all saying. They're going to go home, and someone was just on the internet, and this is what they read. And this is something they read that has a lot of people watching. This is what they're going to read. Author Chris Kresser says there's not a single study that shows that among relatively equivalent groups of people, vegetarians or vegan, relatively equivalent groups of people, vegetarians or vegans have a lifespan advantage. He says that even if we're saying that processed meat, red meat, increases the risk of cancer by 18%, it's not showing up in any of the total mortality data. He says, according to a new editorial published in the journal Nutrition, the author reviewed 19 meta-analyses, 9 observational trials, and 10 randomized controlled trials, and found no consistent association between saturated fat intake and heart disease. What's more, the American Heart Association has distorted and cherry-picked evidence to support its ongoing recommendation to limit saturated fat in the diet. In the American Heart Association's recent meta-analysis, which they used to justify their dietary guidelines, they included studies that didn't meet their own inclusion criteria and were riddled with confounding factors, and they excluded studies with no convincing reason that didn't find an association between saturated fat and heart disease. There's also the rather uncomfortable problem that recent meta-analysis have found that total dairy, milk, high-fat dairy, cheese, butter, eggs, and unprocessed red meats are not associated with cardiovascular disease outcomes. Dairy products are the only category of food that consistently contains more saturated fatty acids than other types of fat, polyunsaturated and monounsaturated. So if saturated fats cause heart disease, then why don't we see a strong association between full-fat dairy and heart disease? Also, several studies, including a recent large review, including 500,000 participants, have shown that saturated fat intake is inversely associated with stroke risk. In this meta-analysis, every 10-gram a day increase in saturated fatty acid intake was associated with a 6% decrease in the risk of stroke. So as you can see, we don't have anything close to a consensus on the relationship between saturated fat and heart disease. And the same is true for the relationship between animal foods in general and other health outcomes. The saddest thing about this is, for me, is that this constant focus on consensus and appeal to authority and all the fruitless debates that come out of it distract our focus from the most important factors. First, the overall quality of our diet is far more important than the specific amount of any particular macronutrient, fat, carbohydrate, or food, red meat, dairy, that we eat. And second, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. We absolutely must stop assuming that there is one single diet that will work for everyone. We know through both research and clinical experience that it isn't true, yet this is still the overwhelming focus of nutritional science and dietary guidelines.
You go ahead.
That was Chris Kresser, who is a chiropractor who writes a lot. He was on the Joe Rogan podcast that got 1 million views. He debated the guy who from Game Changers. He debated Joel Kahn. So he's got an influence, and this is what he wrote.
Okay. First of all, the Blue Zone data puts the kibosh on all of that nonsense. But you know what? Whoever wrote that, he has my permission to eat all of the saturated fat and red meat and processed meat he could possibly consume in a single day. Forgive me for being so glib, but I said before, I refuse to relitigate these things time and time again. The Adventist Health Study, which has been going on for years, has shown a consistent longevity advantage for people who are plant-based. The the studies out of Harvard, the nurses and physicians health studies, the Blue Zone data, it is complete, just rancid BS for some troll to be sitting up here citing a bunch of garbage studies trying to confuse people. If he wants to eat dead animals and saturated fat, have at it, dude. The rest of us are going to be over here living our life and having a good time.
Well said. You can find almost anything when you do a PubMed search, and it is true that Epic Oxford didn't find a significant difference in longevity. There was a study back in 1999 that it was a meta-analysis, and they didn't find any significant advantage for plant-based eaters versus omnivores who were similar health-conscious individuals, even though the whole group was much healthier than the general population. They found a 5% advantage for the vegetarians, but it wasn't significant. And then another study in 2012 had a similar result. It was a meta-analysis, and the vegetarians had 9% lower risk of mortality, but again, it wasn't statistically significant. Epic Oxford didn't find a statistically significant difference in mortality, although the total mortality of the entire cohort was half that of the general population. Now, with the Seventh-day Adventist, the Adventist Health Study 2, there definitely was a significant difference found, and I mean, they were comparing similar health-conscious omnivores with lacto-vegetarians and vegans, and the difference was really very significant. So I think that over time, one of the issues is diet quality. A lot of people eating vegetarian are not eating a high quality diet, and even eating vegan are not necessarily eating a very high quality diet. And as the research continues to unfold, we may see studies coming out looking at people eating truly whole food plant-based diets. And I believe as those studies come out more and more, we will see bigger and bigger advantages for people eating plant-based. I think it's very unfortunate when we've got people like Dr. Walter Willett and Dr. David Katz, who are some of the leading epidemiologists in the world. Dr. Walter Willett with over 1,700 papers. He's the most quoted epidemiologist in the world. He has literally torn apart piece by piece the studies that Chris Kresser is quoting. They were highly flawed, and they just ignore that somehow. They were very highly flawed. As a matter of fact, just to give you an example, the Chowdhury study, they were comparing people in various countries. So they compared people in Finland and people in the States and people in Japan, but they didn't compare the people in Japan with the people in Finland. So when they compared people in Finland consuming 14% of calories from saturated fat with people consuming 15 or 16, they didn't really see much of a difference in cardiovascular disease risk. And nor did the people in Japan when they compared people eating 4% or 5% or 6%. But had they actually compared the people in Finland with the people of Japan, bingo, they would have seen a very big difference. The one study that showed a big difference was Epic Oxford, which actually fairly compared the omnivores with the vegans. And there was a very significant difference in cardiovascular disease risk. So I think we need to be very, very careful, and I think they're cherry picking, and they're not cherry picking very well. I mean, the evidence, as Dr. Katz said, is absolutely overwhelming in terms of how beneficial plant-based diets are. And the American Diabetes Association and the American Heart Association and all of these different groups that are urging people to get away from the saturated fat and eat more unsaturated plant foods, foods that are higher in unsaturated fats, they're not pulling this stuff out of the rear ends. If you look at the presidential report from 2017, which is the American Heart Association presidential report, the ACC, the American College of Cardiology, if you look at their reports, they've taken the leading people these are the world's authority on cardiovascular health, and they've examined every study that's ever been done to come up with what they know will provide the public with the greatest protection. And so, yes, the ACC and the AHA say not more than 5 to 6% of calories from saturated fat. Well, that's what the average vegan gets. Good luck getting that when you're eating a lot of high-fat dairy products. So I think we just need to be very, very cautious of what people who have that agenda are saying.
The other thing I'd like to add is that we also have to make sure we pay attention to functional capacity. And I'll give you a very brief little anecdote. Years ago, I was arguing with this woman, it descended into an argument at work about the benefits of plant-based eating, and she says, oh, my grandfather ate everything. He ate meat all the time, and he's lived to be, I think he was 83 at the time. And I'm like, well, some people have resistant genes, Well, a couple weeks later, she came in depressed and like, what's going on? Well, my grandmother's having a really hard time because, my grandfather's bedridden and incontinent, and she's having to do all this work by herself. I'm like, this was the paragon of virtue you're holding up as an example of what a good life eating meat will give you? Someone who's demented, bedridden, and incontinent? That is not living. So again, when we look at the quality of life between plant-based people and meat eaters, again, what studies have been done, those that have been done have consistently shown that people who are plant-based need fewer medications, if any, require fewer doctor's visits, and are more functional and living a fuller life. And quite frankly, I don't think laying up in a hospital bed with bed sores and a diaper on is living.
And I think Dr. Mills hit the nail on the head, and this is the key with the blue zones, is not only do they have more centenarians than anywhere else in the world, but when people hit 90 or 100 years of age, they are actually still productive. They're still walking up mountains. They're still going to their gardens. I remember reading when Dan Buettner went to Okinawa to interview one of the centenarians, a 100-year-old man. As he was driving up to the house, this centenarian lived with his 70-year-old son. And as he drove up to the house, he sees this man walking out the door briskly with a bunch of gardening tools over his shoulder, pair of shorts on. He's walking toward the garden. And he ran over to him and he said, I'm here to interview your father. And the man said, my father? He was the 100-year-old man. And that's the point.